Denuclearization talks appear to be back on track following the historic encounter between North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and U.S. President Donald Trump at the Demilitarized Zone. Following the symbolic rendezvous, the task at hand now is turning this opportunity into tangible results. For an in-depth discussion on the prospects of denuclearization talks going forward and how to avoid a repetition of the no-deal Hanoi summit, Arirang TV sat down with Dr. James Carafano, Vice President of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. Okay, Dr. James Carafano, welcome to the program. So let's start with the latest developments we've seen on the Korean Peninsula. So history was in the making over the weekend on the Korean Peninsula. Donald Trump became the first U.S. president to step onto North Korean soil. Now, what did you make of the overall meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un at the DMZ?
Well, on the one hand, I'd say I would never think I'd see something like that in my lifetime. And my experiences goes back to the 1970s when I was stationed here in the military. On the other hand, I find this totally unsurprising. This is classic Donald Trump. I understand the whole visit came together in less than 24 hours and actually started with the president's tweet, and the three governments somehow figured out how to pull this off. You know, he's a very unconventional statesman, and that goes without saying. But what that means is he is not kind of trapped by the way people say, well, this is the way you have to do things because this is the way we've always done things. He just pushes that aside. And when people say, well, you're giving away too much and everything, that's not the way he sees it. He doesn't value that differently, like getting to meet him or sit down with him is a natural concession. His notion is, how can you negotiate with somebody if you don't meet with them? So his whole calculus of diplomacy is different. So it's, I think, definitely perfectly in keeping with his style of diplomacy. And I think it leaves us relatively optimistic for the future that at least from the U.S. side, they think that the diplomatic channel is still open. Otherwise, he wouldn't have risked the embarrassment of being turned down by offering the meeting.
So instead of what many thought would be a short encounter at the border village, the two sides actually had almost an hour of talking together. And following that meeting, Trump said that working level talks between the two sides will resume within a matter of 2 to 3 weeks. How do you see things playing out from here on?
Well, it's very clear. It's very clear that all three governments are deeply interested in keeping the diplomatic process open. That's, I think, the good news. And the fact that they're both reorganizing their teams, and particularly, I think we want to watch what does the North Korean team look like. If we're seeing more foreign policy people, more technical experts, more people who are actually skilled in the kind of actual diplomacy as opposed to party people, I think that could be really significant. To me, the one kind of wild card here is what's really changed in decades of animosity between the United States and South Korea and North Korea. And it really is the president, right? Nothing else has really changed. And so that means that if North Korea is serious about denuclearization, it's because they think that this president is different and he will actually deliver. And if that's true, then I think they have to wonder, well, will he still be around in a year and a half because we have national elections coming up? And so part of me thinks that even if the North Koreans are sincere about moving down this path, they'll want to be confident that Trump is going to get reelected and that he's going to be a partner to be there for them. So I'm not so sure how quickly the talks would actually culminate.
If we go back to the no-deal Hanoi summit in February, North Korea had asked for lifting of key sanctions while the U.S. had demanded more concrete denuclearization steps. Now, following the DMZ encounter, do you think either side will be able to make more concessions? If so, what should the bare minimum be?
I don't think you're going to see a lot of change on the U.S. side. I think the Hanoi summit was really important. And I actually think it was a success for both sides, and here's why. Because I think the North Koreans went to the Hanoi summit testing a proposition. And the proposition is this really the U.S. negotiating position, or can they be backed off on that? And I think what they found at that summit was, no, this was actually the president's negotiating position, and that the U.S. is going to stick to that. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that every nuclear reactor and every nuclear weapon have to be out of North Korea before there are any sanctions lifted whatsoever. What I think it does mean is that the two countries have to agree on a clear path to denuclearization with clear waypoints ahead, and that normalization would move in accordance with that. Now, what exactly that looks like, I think that'll be negotiated. But what I think the U.S. is not going to do is say, well, you give us something in good faith, and then maybe we'll do something. That's just not going to happen. And here's, I think, what's more important is nobody's, I think, ever going to go back to that. I think if the North Koreans don't commit to a negotiated process here, then I'm not really sure what the alternative is. This is arguably the best opportunity they've ever gotten. There's very little interest or confidence in the United States going back to something like the six-party talks. I'm not sure there's an other path forward. I'm not sure there's a path backward for North Korea at this point.
Staying with that, do you think between now and whenever there is actually another summit, the two sides will find common ground over what they mean exactly by denuclearization? Because they still have to narrow the gap when it comes to what that definition actually is. And what sort of developments do you think we'll need to see for it to be considered progress?
Well, I know the first thing that would really give the U.S. tremendous confidence that the North Koreans were serious would be a full and complete listing of all their nuclear assets, a complete and verifiable accounting for all their nuclear assets, which honestly is a prerequisite for denuclearization. You can't really do it without it. In a sense, putting all those cards on the table, I think would be a really profound statement and would even convince people like me who are very skeptical that North Korea is actually willing to do this. I think that might be a game changer.
Given North Korea's behavior in the past in the summits, do you see that as a likely possibility, though?
I don't know this. Even if North Korea is serious about committing to denuclearization, and let's be honest, both sides know what the United States means by that. It means at the end of this process, there are no nuclear weapons or the capability to make nuclear weapons in North Korea. I don't know how, even if they're serious about it, I don't know how long that process takes. Like I said, if you're from the North Korean side, I mean, if I was the head of North Korea, I want to say, well, is Donald Trump going to get reelected? Because if he's not going to get reelected, why should I make a deal with this guy? And if you remember back in the early 2000s, the North Koreans made an initiative to President Clinton to improve relations, and they had a bunch of meetings, and Secretary Albright went to Pyongyang, and everything was great. And then a new president came in, and they had a very different idea about what to do. So I could have told the North Koreans that's not a very smart idea. You don't make a deal with the guy who's going out; you make a deal with the guy that's coming in. So I think that's a wild card. Will President Trump be around to deal with? Now, I think the odds seem to be pretty good that he is going to get reelected. And if I were the North Koreans, I would certainly plan like Trump is the guy I have to deal with for the next 6 years.
What do you think should be the role of regional players in the denuclearization issue, given like Russia or China or Japan or the likes?
I get that question a lot. I mean, honestly, I think in the end, it'll come down to what the United States and South Korea and North Korea agree to. I think China, in the end, is actually better off with a denuclearized North Korea. And so I really don't see where China would be a great obstacle in the path to denuclearization. I'm not sure they're going to be a game changer in getting it done, but I don't really see it as an obstacle. I don't really see Russia as a real player in this at all. And I think the Japanese have great trust and confidence in their relationship with the United States. And of course, Japan would be thrilled if North Korea denuclearized. But like I said, I just think, in the United States, the saying is the ball is in Kim's court, which I guess is basketball, which is, I guess other people play basketball too. But really is if he makes a decision to do this, it happens. If he doesn't make the decision to do this, it doesn't happen. And we go back to the status quo, which, you know what? Japan, South Korea, China can all live with the status quo. And North Korea can too, I guess. But it's really, perpetual misery for the people of North Korea. And the only person that can change that is Kim.
Now, the Trump administration's North Korea policy and his personal chemistry with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is very, very different to his predecessors. In your opinion, has this had a positive impact on solving the nuclear issue with North Korea?
I do think it is a key component in which has allowed the diplomacy to move forward. I think if you look at it from the North Korean perspective, where you've been brought up your entire life being convinced that the greatest threat to your regime is the United States, what's changed? And the only thing that's really changed is Donald Trump's personal intervention and his personal commitment to that. And so I don't think we'd be where we are without it.
Staying with that, some see President Trump's visit to the DMZ as a well-calculated political move, considering the re-election. Do you think his Seoul trip, as well as the G20 summit in Japan, has backed him the diplomatic success that he needs?
I actually think they just threw it on the table at the last minute. Now, it might have been something that a message the Chinese brought, you know, to the G20 from North Korea. I don't know, but clearly that was something that was not in the cards. I think one thing that needs to be really crystal clear is the negotiations with North Korea have zero impact on U.S. elections and zero calculations in U.S. politics. The president does not need a deal with North Korea to get elected. The people that aren't going to vote for him, he could get a deal with the devil and they're still not going to vote for him. The people that are going to vote for him, if the negotiations fail, they'll say, well, you tried and we appreciate that. The president is pursuing this policy not because it's good politics, but because it's a good policy for everybody. It's good for North Korea, it's good for South Korea, it's good for the United States, which is the right reason to be pursuing something.
So staying with that, given the U.S. elections, it also sets a time frame in part if North Korea wants to reach a deal on denuclearization before the end of Trump's term. Now, Pyongyang has also given the U.S. until the end of this year to be a little bit more flexible. Do you think that this is something that's achievable within a few months or within a year?
Look, from the U.S. perspective, as long as North Korea doesn't go backwards in terms of testing or other provocative acts, he'll do a deal now, he'll do a deal in 2 years. He'll always be there to do a deal. I think from North Korea's perspective, the calculus is, well, we'll trust he'll be there. And if he is there, where is our greater leverage? Is it making a deal before the election or making a deal after the election? And I think the only one who can really, that's going to get decided in North Korea, and there's nothing the U.S., I think, or South Korea can do to really do that. But if their notion is some kind of sanction rollback to keep the diplomacy going, that's just not in the cards. It's just not going to happen.
If Trump is not reelected, do you see the denuclearization process going back to square one?
I don't know. One, it'll depend on who gets elected and who their foreign policy team is. If North Korea wants to keep their nuclear weapons and continue to negotiate in a piecemeal manner, that might actually be more feasible, because you might get people in who want to go back to six-party talks and try other things. It's difficult to say. I mean, I think right now the odds are, you know, Trump would get really elected. In U.S. politics, incumbent presidents usually have a significant advantage. There's really only two things that really upset that. One is the economy gets really bad or they start a war. I don't think either of those are likely in this scenario.
So Trump has extended an invitation to Kim Jong-un to visit the White House, and Kim Jong-un has also invited Trump to Pyongyang. How do you see the likeliness of this and prospects of another summit between the two leaders?
Well, I think, I think this time, unlike the other summits, they actually would like to see progress in the underlying talks. I don't think, clearly in the other two summits, progress in the underlying talks was not a prerequisite to get to the summit. The purpose to go to the summit was just to keep the diplomatic channel open. I think now that that's been well established, the next time I think they'd like to be able to put something on the table. So one would be, well, what progress actually gets done by the negotiating teams. The other one, I think, is just the American political calendar. I mean, the closer it gets to the election, the more a president's time is consumed by running for president, the less time there is for foreign travel, the less time there even is to host people here.
And last but not least, how do you assess the South Korea-U.S. alliance? Because the two sides continue to emphasize cooperation and coordination when it comes to dealing with North Korea. But there are reports from time to time that the two sides are out of sync within South Korea. Does Washington really see Seoul as a mediator?
No. Neither does North Korea, and neither does South Korea. I mean, it's just not realistic. I mean, we're allies, and North Korea and South Korea are not. And for the expectation that somehow South Korea would negotiate between the United States and North Korea, nobody practically sees how that's. I don't even think the North Koreans take that really seriously. I think the reality is if you look where we've come over the 2 years, it's remarkable. I think the two governments have grown in trust and confidence. I think they understand where they have differences, but I think President Moon's done a great job, and I think President Moon and President Trump are, you know, if there are two guys that can pull this off, and really it all depends on what Kim does. I mean, if Kim wants to denuclearize, I think, you know, history changes. If he doesn't, there's nothing those two presidents can do to change that. But he has two partners who are very sincere in delivering on our side, which is if there's denuclearization, then there's a real prospect for normalization and a different future for North Korea. So I think both those presidents have plenty to be proud about.
Okay, that's where we'll wrap things up for today. Thank you for your insights, Dr. Carafano.
Thank you for having me.